My name is Abigail Ross, and I'm 30 years old. For nearly 4 years, my entire family believed I was lying, not because I stole money, not because I broke anyone's trust, but because I kept repeating one sentence that nobody wanted to believe. Grandpa promised the lake house to me. Every time I said those words, my father, Stephen, would laugh, my mother, Linda, would sigh, and my older brother, Tyler, would smirk and say, "You really need to let this fantasy go." Eventually, I stopped arguing, because when everyone you love calls you a liar, you begin wondering if defending yourself is even worth it. My grandfather, Walter Ross, wasn't a rich man, but the one thing everyone wanted was his beautiful lake house. It had been in our family for over 60 years, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every summer barbecue. That house held our family's happiest memories. Everyone assumed Tyler would inherit it. He was the oldest grandson. My parents had already started talking about renovations before Grandpa had even passed away, but 2 weeks before he died, Grandpa asked me to visit him alone. He looked weaker than I'd ever seen him. He reached into his bedside drawer, squeezed my hand, and quietly whispered, "Abigail, when the truth comes out, don't argue with anyone." I frowned. "What truth?" He smiled. "You'll know soon enough." Those were the last private words he ever said to me. A few days later, he was gone. After the funeral, the entire family gathered in Grandpa's living room. His attorney, Charles Benson, carefully opened the will. The savings were divided equally. The investments were split fairly, but there wasn't a single mention of the lake house. Tyler immediately smiled. Dad leaned back in his chair. Mom looked directly at me. "Well, I guess that settles it." Room filled with relieved laughter. I stayed completely silent, because Grandpa had never lied to me. 2 days later, Dad invited everyone back to the lake house. He called it a family celebration, but it felt more like a victory party. Tyler walked through every room talking about remodeling the kitchen. Mom was already discussing paint colors. Dad even joked about replacing Grandpa's old fishing dock. Then Tyler raised his glass to finally owning the family house. Everyone cheered. Then Dad looked at me. "Still think Grandpa promised it to you?" I looked him straight in the eye and quietly answered, "Yes." Room instantly went silent. Tyler laughed first, then everyone else joined in. Dad shook his head. "Abigail, enough. You're embarrassing yourself." I lowered my eyes, not because I doubted Grandpa, but because I remembered his last words. Argue with anyone. So, I didn't instead. I waited because somehow, I knew Grandpa wasn't finished speaking. The celebration continued as if I hadn't said anything. Tyler was already measuring the living room walls. Mom kept talking about replacing Grandma's old furniture. Dad walked onto the back porch, proudly telling everyone how the lake house would stay in the right hands. I quietly stepped outside. The cold December air felt easier to breathe than the room full of people who had already decided I was a liar. Just then, Attorney Charles Benson walked out onto the porch. "Abigail," he said softly, "been looking for you." I forced a smile. I guess the house really wasn't mentioned. Charles looked at me for a long moment, then he asked, "Did your grandfather ever tell you not to argue with your family?" My heart skipped a beat. "Yes," said. "When the truth comes out, don't argue with anyone." Charles slowly nodded. I thought so. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a small sealed envelope. Across the front in Grandpa's handwriting were 5 simple words for Abigail. After the reading, my hands started shaking. Charles continued, "Your grandfather instructed me not to give this to anyone unless your family publicly claimed ownership of the house." I looked back through the dining room window. Tyler was laughing while holding Grandpa's old fishing keys. "They already have," I whispered. Charles handed me the envelope. "I believe it's time." Inside was a handwritten letter. "My dear Abigail, if you're reading this, your family has already decided you're lying." Tears filled my eyes. Grandpa knew. He had expected every bit of this. The letter continued. "Blame them. They only know half the story. The other half is waiting inside the old oak cabinet in my study." I frowned. The oak cabinet, Grandpa had always kept it locked. Nobody except him had ever opened it. At the bottom of the letter was one final sentence. "Inside is something they can never argue with. When they hear my voice, everything will change." Looked up at Charles. "What did he leave in that cabinet?" Charles smiled slightly. "Never seen it. Your grandfather made one thing very clear," said. Charles paused before repeating Grandpa's exact words. "The moment my family calls Abigail a liar." Play. Nobody knew what was inside Grandpa's study except me and Attorney Charles Benson. We walked back into the living room together. Tyler looked annoyed. "What's taking so long?" Dad laughed. "Maybe she's finally accepted reality." I ignored him. Instead, I walked down the hallway toward Grandpa's old study. The room hadn't changed. His reading glasses still rested on the desk. His favorite fishing hat still hung behind the door, and in the corner stood the old oak cabinet, exactly where Grandpa said it would be. Charles pulled a small brass key from his pocket. "Your grandfather left this with me." Cabinet clicked open. Inside was only one small wooden box, no cash, no jewelry, just a box. Across the lid were 6 handwritten words. "Play this in front of everyone." My heart was pounding. We carried the box into the living room. The conversation stopped immediately. Dad frowned. "What is this?" Charles calmly answered, "Mr. Walter Ross instructed me to open this only after today's discussion." Tyler rolled his eyes. More fairy tales. Ignoring him, Charles opened the box. Inside was an old digital voice recorder and a sealed envelope. Charles picked up the recorder first. He pressed the play button. Static filled the room for a second. Then, Grandpa's voice echoed through the entire house. "If you're hearing this, then my family has already called Abigail a liar." Every smile disappeared. Tyler slowly lowered his drink. Dad's face turned completely white. Grandpa continued, "Abigail never lied. I promised her this lake house almost 4 years ago," Mom gasped. Grandpa's calm voice filled every corner of the room. "Because she's my favorite. Because she was the only person who cared for me without expecting anything in return." He paused. "Stephen." My father's head lifted instantly. "You stopped visiting after I refused to lend you money." Dad couldn't even look up. "Linda, you only came when someone else invited you." Mom quietly looked down at the floor. Then Grandpa said the words that stunned everyone. "Tyler, you visited me exactly 3 times in the last 2 years. Abigail visited me 184 times. The room fell completely silent. Grandpa continued, "If anyone tells you this house belongs to someone else, they're lying." Charles slowly opened the sealed envelope. Inside was one final legal document. He looked at everyone before speaking. "This is the registered deed transfer. It was signed 3 years ago." He turned toward me. "Effective immediately after Walter Ross's passing." He smiled. "The lake house legally belongs to Abigail Ross." Nobody said a single word. For the second time that day, Grandpa's voice had filled the room, and this time, no one called me a liar anymore. No one spoke. Grandpa's recording had done what I never could. It told the truth. My father stared at the deed in Charles Benson's hands as though the paper itself had betrayed him. Finally, he whispered, I didn't know." Attorney Charles looked at him calmly. "You knew enough to call your daughter a liar without checking the facts." Dad lowered his head. There was no response. Tyler slowly placed Grandpa's old house keys on the coffee table. "I don't want them," he said quietly. "They were never mine." He turned toward me. "I'm sorry, Abby. I believed what everyone else wanted to believe." I nodded. "I know." Then my mother stood up. Tears filled her eyes. "We should have trusted you. Made you feel like you had to prove yourself in your own family." I smiled sadly. It wasn't the house that hurt. It was realizing none of you believed me. Those words hung in the room. For years, I'd cared for Grandpa because I loved him, not because I expected anything in return. Yet when I spoke the truth, my own family chose the easier story instead. Attorney Charles handed me the official deed. "Congratulations, Ms. Ross. This property is now legally yours." Holding that document didn't feel like winning. It felt like keeping a promise Grandpa had already made. Over the next few weeks, I moved into the lake house. I didn't remodel it. I left Grandpa's reading chair by the fireplace. His fishing rods stayed exactly where he had left them. Even the old wind chimes on the porch remained untouched. The house didn't need a new owner. It simply needed someone who loved it. A month later, Dad asked if we could meet for coffee. He apologized without making excuses. Mom admitted they had always assumed I would understand while expecting Tyler to be given more because he struggled financially. I listened, then I quietly said, being responsible shouldn't mean being overlooked. Neither of them argued. Tyler eventually visited the lake house one afternoon, not to ask for anything, just to help me repair Grandpa's old dock. As we worked side by side, he smiled. "You know, Grandpa would have loved seeing this." I smiled back. "Think he already does." Sometimes people leave behind money, sometimes they leave behind property. But Grandpa left me something far more valuable, the confidence to stand by the truth. Even when everyone I loved insisted I was wrong. Because the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one telling the truth. Sometimes, the truth waits patiently until it's finally heard.